Okay, so next let's look at the standard of living. Like, how did these changes, how did these broad scale changes, this for the first time we have, economic growth, how did this affect the common worker? And this is the question that has been kind of been asked by many students throughout this quarter. It's like, okay, here's the GDP data, but what's going on with, that's the aggregate, the average. What's going on, at the individual level? Like, are these gains trickling down to, your kind of regular workers? This is this is a topic of considerable debate because basically on the one side it's ideological. It's on the one side you have kind of your pro economic growth, pro market economy people who are like, look, the gains were great, like economy grew, and then everybody had higher standards of living, everything was great. On the other side you have kind of critics of growth, and like you're more like socialist or communist thinkers like Marx, who are like, no, this was terrible. Like, this is, all these gains were just going to, a very, very thin, um, thin capitalist class. So it's an ideological debate, so people are kind of bringing that with them when they go to analyze the data, and there's a lot of motivated reasoning involved. Um, so this is very contentious. I mean, this is not as big of a debate as it was, say, in the 80s or 90s. But there is, this is still up for, I mean, up for debate, and people have very strong feelings about it. Actually, you see it more in the present when looking at like world poverty data, which shows that poverty has been going down. And so there are many people who are like, look, this poverty is going down, the world's getting richer, things are great. And the other side is like, no, 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 that data is all wrong. That's not what it really looks like. Things are awful. Um, so you have, these types of debates still playing out. So your pessimists, your people who are like, okay, we have the Industrial Revolution. There's this burst in economic activity. Your pessimist, your critics of growth will be like, this wasn't actually that good. These mills that people worked in, these like early factories, were terrible places to work, which is true. And so you have this poem, Dark Satanic Mills, or the characteristic characterizing them as dark satanic mills. You have kind of that Dickensian poverty. If you read Charles Dickens, you have like these like these portraits of poverty, and really people are seeing that as the Industrial Revolution is kind of causing that poverty. Me personally, I would argue that what's happening is your poverty is just moving from the rural to the urban. So if you were to go look at rural settings, this is true in the present. Like, we think of poverty as an urban phenomena, but in many countries, many developing countries, if you go to the rural areas, there's crushing poverty. It's just nobody ever goes to the rural areas. You never go, you never see what these places are like. But if you go, I've been to some very, very rural areas. And if you go and look at it, it's, the poverty is much worse than what urban poverty can look like. And so, as what industrialization does, is it brings jobs to cities, or it brings various economic activities to the cities, to the urban centers. That pulls in people from the countryside, and so it just moves poverty from the rural setting to the urban setting. It doesn't necessarily cause a poverty, in my opinion. Again, as I said, this is up for debate. Now, Marx was really motivated by what was going on in this time period, where you see industrialization, you see a slim class of people getting very wealthy. And so for Marx, it was like, okay, you have all this growth, but it's being funneled to the top. So the industrialization, this process doesn't really help the proletariat, it doesn't really help the workers. It just helps the top. We're producing so much more, but the gains of all that are just going to the top. And so this time period is called the Engels pause, because you have all this economic growth, but it hasn't really been filtering down to the whole society. And it was really, it motivated Marx and Engels to write their influential works. The optimistic view of it was like, okay, you get the Industrial Revolution, and so what that creates is all these goods, shirts, whatever, shoes, that are cheaper. So even if you don't see it in the wage data, the standard of living data, like how much people are making, what they can buy so much more. So even if you don't see it on the wage side, what they can actually buy has expanded immensely. Also, they say, look, the Industrial Revolution into the Malthusian trap. For the first time, we see, population growth and economic growth. So, you know, before the Industrial Revolution, if you had population growth, you're going to have a decline in your economic growth. So again, they're saying like, look, the economy is growing and the population is growing. And so again, even if on average it's not filtering down, we're having growth in another sense that we never had before. We were able to have both population growth and economic growth at the same time. And then of course, in the long run, eventually those gains do filter down. In the long run, we do see wages and standard of living increasing. The question really is, okay, when did it happen? How long did it take from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to really see wide scale gains for the working class? Okay, so you look at some of the wage data, it looks like it starts to come um, in the early 1800s. There's lots of critics of this wage data. So they argue it's sensitive to the price index use. All right, so what does that mean? So this is what's really tricky. When you're doing wage data, when you're comparing wages over time, you need to adjust for purchasing power. So you need to adjust for what can people buy with those wages. So you think of, right now we just got hit with huge inflation numbers. So a 4% increase in inflation. What that means is prices have gone up by 4%. So if I'm comparing wages this year to last year, I need to adjust for that. What I make this year is not, if I make just the same this year, that is actually less than I made last year because I can buy a lot less with my money because prices have gone up. So you have to make this adjustment, and this adjustment is very tricky. It's especially tricky in the world of technological progress because the goods you are buying, even though they say they're the same, the quality has increased by a lot. So oftentimes you don't adjust for that. And so that can make things look much worse than they really are. So it's like, it's like here, I have these headphones, all right? Wireless headphones, right? If I'm adjusting for the cost of the price of headphones, between now and say 1985, we treat these headphones as just as headphones. Now, of course, these headphones are so much better than the 1985 headphones. It's like not even, they're barely the same good. These things, they're wireless, they are comfortable, they last forever compared to those 1985 headphones. And so this is what makes comparison of wages so difficult between times, where it's really, really difficult to make these adjustments for purchasing power because it depends on what goods you look at. It depends on the quality of those goods. Anyways, I'm just oftentimes what I'm trying to convey is just how complex these questions are. And unfortunately, when you go out to the public sphere, they just get boiled down to a soundbite. Wages are stagnating, without considering like how difficult it is to actually capture that number and make that comparison. And maybe that comparison is utterly useless. I mean, you think about wages in the present compared to wages in 1970. Does anybody want to go back to 1970? You could pay me double what I make. I don't want to go back to 1970. You can't buy anything good in 1970. So it's like, I mean, like, come on, in 1970, if I go surfing, I'm gonna be wearing like a super thick wetsuit that I could barely paddle in, riding some stupid board, they don't even, all the Legos are terrible in 1970. I don't want to go to 1970. All right, I'm on a tangent. Okay, so the point is, this wage data has critics. They're saying, okay, your price index is wrong. Even if we see rising wages, maybe that's just compensating for the terrible conditions because cities were very deadly in this time period. And the places where workers worked were also had really terrible conditions. It's also not looking at the self-employed. And also, I included this detail from an 1852 cookbook that I think this detail is from More from Less, which I had you read, which is just kind of looking at what the working class was eating. And so we don't see that. So consumption of luxury goods like tea and sugar do not rise with wages. So this would suggest that there's something else going on, that the workers can't really buy these luxury goods. And then we can see what they're eating. Breakfast is boiled milk with a spoonful of flour and a dash of salt. I hope that at some odd times you may afford yourself an old hen. So at least in the quality of life doesn't seem to be translating to the workers. Even if we're seeing rising wages, it doesn't seem like their quality of life is increasing. Standard of living, we can look at, instead of looking at wages, we can look at income per person. This is like overall income per person. Again, there's not much improvement between the late 1700s and the early 1800s. We do see improvement by the middle of sort of the starting to get the back half of the 1800s. Another thing we can look at is height. Again, we've talked about using height before as a proxy for growth. Here you can see the urban area is doing much worse than the rural area, which would suggest that the cities are deadly and that people in the cities are not doing much better. Some more height data that doesn't show any growth. Although this is military height, so the sample selection issues, this could be just pulling from the lower class and not the broader population. You do finally see some improvement in the 20th century in height. Okay. Long run death rates, another way we can look at it is like, okay, if people are dying less, that would suggest that the quality of life is getting better. We see some decline starting in the beginning of the 1800s, although it really doesn't get going until the back half of the 1800s. Literacy, we have a similar story. Literacy really doesn't take off until the back half of the 1800s. We can do the HDI, which is the Human Development Index, which is a composite measure of life expectancy, education, and GDP, trying to basically augment GDP by capturing these other aspects of life. How long are people living and how educated they are? Here, here again, we see that kind of a similar story, that the pickup, the X's are the HDI, the pickup really isn't till the back half of the 1800s. So the conclusions, the weight of the evidence would suggest that the industrialization, the industrial revolution that occurs in the late 1700s and the early 1800s doesn't really quantitatively impact workers' lives until the late 1800s. So there's about a 50-year gap, the Engels pause, before workers actually see improvements. Now, this is very specific to the UK. If you go to the present, when a country industrializes, typically we see life expectancy going up, heights going up almost immediately. So there's no longer this Engels pause, and so it's still debate like what's going on? How come it took so long to translate to the workers? Now the answers are, we'll go back and I'll cover this later, but just to, whatever, spoiler alert for later in the lecture. So it could be that there was a lot of war. I mean, this is England's at war basically this entire period. And also, you don't have the health improvements. Like cities are very, very deadly. That London is a very deadly place, rife with disease, and so you don't have those concurrent health improvements that you see now. When a country develops, it also has various health investments, making their cities less deadly. Okay, we're gonna move back to the U.S. and talk about skilled and unskilled labor after this break.